LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of November the 4th. I hope you all had a happy Halloween and a very safe one. My book here, speaking of Halloween, is still available to buy. Grim Grimoire, a collection of horror short stories, now available at Amazon in paperback and ebook form. Go over and check that out. And, it's kind of interesting because we were talking about Halloween and the book at the beginning, but what the show is going to be about today is nothing frightening. It might have been frightening for Richard Donner.
Well, I'm sure many kids dressed up as him for Halloween over the years. Those little
Superman.
plastic masks and that little apron costume thing you used to get at the drugstore.
At the Dollar Tree.
Yeah.
At the Bargain Town.
Yes.
Well, what we're talking about today is Superman, specifically Superman Part 1 and Superman Part 2. This is the beginning of a series, a two-part series, in which we're going to cover the entire Superman film series. We're talking about the Superman that we grew up with. If you're our age, which we won't say what that age is, Christopher Reeve was your Superman.
Yes, he was. He was my first. Him and the lead singer from a-ha were my first crushes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I can understand the Christopher Reeve one. Because he just looked like he had stepped right off the page of a comic book. I mean, he was so perfectly cast as Superman. And as we go through this, we'll get into how that casting took place. I guess we'll start at the beginning.
It's a very good place to start, they say.
That's what they say. 1973, a guy named Ilya Salkin, a young man, relatively young, came up with the idea of making Superman into a film. Superman being a very popular comic book that at this point had been around for many years, since the 30s, Action Comics #1. Ilya's father was a well-respected European film producer named Alexander Salkin. And a childhood friend of Ilya's was a guy named Pierre Spengler. And Pierre and Alexander co-owned a company in which they produced films. So Ilya tried to sell his dad on the idea of making Superman into a major motion picture. And what
hadn't been done since
had not been done.
The 50s?
Yes, and never in so grand a form. And that was Ilya's idea. Don't do a small B-movie Superman. Make it a huge event.
Yes.
And, this is 73, so this is right at the beginning of what would become known as summer tentpole movies. A lot of people say Jaws, which works into this, was the first summer tentpole movie. So they eventually managed to wrangle from DC Comics, which at the time was called National, a deal in which they could make a Superman movie. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself was, I believe, a difficult proposition. But the Salkins had made a number of films, and they were known for making quality films at a relatively lower budget, and creating a success out of them. They had recently done
Three Musketeers?
The Three and Four Musketeers, which was a film that was shot back to back,
which Richard Lester
directed. He directed them. Yeah. And a director named Richard Lester, who we'll get into here shortly. Now, the DC Comics folks, they like the idea of doing it big time, big summer movie. And so they actually wanted to see a star play Superman. So a list was drawn up, which was presented to DC Comics.
And these lists.
Yeah, and they had to for their approval. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a few names of who DC approved to be Superman based on the Salkins list.
I think I've heard a couple of these.
Al Pacino. Now you have to remember, this is fresh off The Godfather, like literally fresh. The Godfather is still warm in the movie theaters. And so Al Pacino, who was a literal nobody before The Godfather, was suddenly kind of hot.
Yeah.
So DC was like, yeah, Al Pacino, which is kind of a crazy choice.
I love Al Pacino, but not as Superman, no.
No, he's a little short.
Yes.
A little short.
And he's very tiny.
Speaking of short, Dustin Hoffman. Not too long after Mike Nichols made him a star with The Graduate. So he was kind of a hot name at the time, too. He was originally considered and approved by DC on this list of possible Supermen. Dustin Hoffman. All I can think about is him floating in the pool, while while Simon and Garfunkel are singing. I'm not sure that I can imagine him as Superman. He was up for the part of Lex Luthor later.
See, that would be.
I could see, he turned it down.
Yeah.
But I could see that.
I could see him as Lex Luthor.
What about Steve McQueen as Superman?
He
was
on
the
interesting.
list. Yeah, I mean, at least that's like a, man's man, kind of a big guy, tough guy.
We're getting warmer.
Let me throw this one at you.
Okay.
Clint Eastwood.
No,
not Superman. No, he's tough, but he's not Superman.
Maybe like this.
Could you imagine him whispering his way through some of those Smallville scenes and stuff? No, I don't think that would have worked.
No.
Muhammad Ali. DC approved Muhammad Ali to possibly play Superman.
But is he an actor?
No. And I think that was his thing.
He could be a muscle man, obviously, but
I think maybe they were thinking physique.
Yeah.
And famously there was a comic book that had Superman boxing Muhammad Ali on it. But yeah, I don't know for Superman. I think the thing was, and maybe the reason Muhammad Ali wasn't particularly interested in doing it was the acting side of it.
Yeah.
Because you do have to act, and he was not an actor.
And you have to play two roles, basically.
Clark Kent and Superman.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they went through a lot. This production, we'll try and hit on as much as we can. We'll talk for a minute about some of the screenwriters. William Goldman is a very well-known and well-loved and sadly deceased now screenwriter who wrote so many great movies. Marathon Man always comes to mind.
Yeah.
And he did a number of Stephen King adaptations. He wrote the script for Misery.
Mm-hmm.
He's a great screenwriter. He was one of the first people they went to, the Salkins, in trying to develop a screenplay for the first Superman movie, which incidentally would become two movies ultimately. William Goldman looked at it and just was like, I don't know how to do this. Like, I don't see a movie here. He didn't see it. And so, instead of trying to force him to do something that he doesn't really want to do, they were like, well, we would love for you to write it, but if you really don't see a movie in this, which I think Elia Salkin was like, how could you not see a movie? This is a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
But Goldman was not interested.
We also have to point out the comic book film. This is the movie that created that whole as we know it
and
today.
When we were young, there was no comic book film. There was Superman, and then there was Batman, the Tim Burton Batman. Yeah. So you didn't have an abundance of this kind of stuff. So you have to remember in the 70s, what they're drawing on are comic books, which are at this point have devolved a lot of times into camp and are now kind of coming out of camp.
Yeah.
You had the Batman TV show, which I'm sure a lot of people were going, oh, it's going to be like, Superman, like Batman TV show.
Yeah, it's going to be campy.
Goofy, and maybe some of these big stars like Steve McQueen aren't really interested in being
We really also hadn't gotten to, they were campy. They were television budgets, but a lot of the comic book TV shows really hadn't started coming out yet.
No.
Really yet.
Not really. Wonder Woman was on its way.
Yeah. Hulk.
And stuff like that. Ooh, the Hulk.
Yeah. ISIS.
But anyway, I love me some Wonder Woman, man. But the Hulk, with Lou Ferrigno.
I have a soft spot for it. I loved it when I was a kid.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll move on.
Okay.
Mario Puzo. Speaking of the Godfather, everything in this is very Godfather centric because that was the big thing. It had won all the Academy Awards. It was in everyone's mind. It was the big movie.
Yeah.
So, that's where you get people like Al Pacino being up for Superman. James Caan, actually, who played Sonny in The Godfather. Yeah. He thought about it, but he said, man, I just can't wear that suit. Because he's a real tough guy. He's like, I'm not wearing those tights. Yeah. So James Caan said no. So there's a couple of Godfather connections. Here's another one. Mario Puzo.
He wrote one of the...
He wrote the novel for The Godfather and co-wrote the screenplay with Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
So he was very much a name like William Goldman. And so he was the second person they went to. And unlike Goldman, Mario Puzo really lit to this idea and thought, well, yeah, that's interesting. I think I could do something with this, And maybe he was thinking, well, maybe if I do this and I do it well, people will stop saying I'm the gangster guy, the gangster novelist guy, So he took a crack at it. $600,000 they paid him. And the idea that they came up with at that point was, let's copy our Three Musketeer, Four Musketeer idea. Let's think about this as two movies. Mm-hmm. And that allowed Mario Puzo, a novelist, to think about the script in long form, which is not something you generally get to do with a film.
Yeah, particularly something like this, which no one had ever
done before. There was a lot of
scale.
There was so much experimentation going on with this movie, and we'll get more into that later. Mario Puzo wound up turning in a 400-page script for part 1 and 2.
But they didn't really feel like it was Superman-y. It didn't have a lot of the.
You're right. There's not a lot of Puzo.
I've never read.
It's a massive script. I mean, well, and they made it even more. Puzo's was fairly serious.
Yes.
His 400-page script, which even if you divide that into 200 pages for a single film script, is a lot. It's a little long.
It's going to be a Godfather.
They started to approach directors with Puzo's script, and amongst the people they approached, can you guess who the first person they approached was? It has to do with the Godfather.
Oh.
His name is Francis Ford Coppola. They were like, let's just make the Godfather in space, the Godfather on Krypton, the Godfather in Kansas.
I'm surprised they just didn't get Marlon Brando to play Superman.
Yeah, well, we're getting there too. Well, Francis Ford Coppola wasn't interested. Yes. Even though his old buddy Puzo was writing the script, he wasn't really into it. So they went to William Friedkin from The Exorcist. Mm-hmm. But he was busy with The Exorcist.
Yes. So he's like, I'm torturing small children and the entire staff right now. I don't have time.
I'm a little busy.
You're gonna have guns and
you're gonna have to do that Flying Cape Man movie on your own.
He's like, you're gonna have to give him back problems on your own.
I'm kidding. And so since they were using the formula of the Three and Four Musketeers, another director they went to was Richard Lester, who had directed the Three and Four Musketeers. Now, Richard Lester was busy with another project at the time, and so was unable to do the film. He will come back into this story rather infamously later.
Because they basically wanted him.
Yes. They was a known commodity, and they had already done 2 films for them. And we'll talk about some of Lester's reaction to the Musketeer movies here shortly when it becomes relevant. And I think it will kind of maybe offer an idea as to how Richard Lester came into this later. They also went to Sam Peckinpah. Now, I would really love to see a Sam Peckinpah Superman movie. Like, he would have turned it into the Wild Bunch or something. I mean, I would really love, like Zod as the Wild Bunch, and the Criminals.
Bob Dylan would have been in it.
Yeah, I'd love to have seen that. What do you think? Interesting, huh?
That's interesting.
But Peckinpah wasn't interested either. I mean, I think Peckinpah was more, he was kind of like Steve McQueen and James Caan is like, I do tough guy movies. This is not a tough guy.
He's too, nice.
He wears tights. We don't do tights.
No, not movies. Big bright blue ones with red panties.
Now, Ilya Salkin, that's a whole different show.
That is, yes.
Salkin, who was the son of Alexander, he had his finger on the pulse of filmmaking in the 1970s. So that said, he told his dad, there's a young filmmaker, made a couple movies. We got to get him to do Superman. His name is Steven Spielberg. And Alexander was like, what are you talking about? So, I don't know this boy. He making fish movie. And
I love your storytelling here.
Thank you.
Puppets. You need puppets.
We wait for the fish movie to come out. If it flops, we say no. If it succeeds, we maybe. And Ilya was like, it's going to succeed, Dad. Like, this guy he's talented. Well, the shark movie, which was Jaws, came out, blew the roof off every bank in the country, became this huge cultural phenomenon. And Spielberg, who was originally interested in Superman after the big shark movie,
he's like, I got it.
He's like, yeah, I got this other alien thing that I wrote.
He says, I got bigger fish to fry. You get it?
I got it. He got aliens to fry. He got other aliens to fry.
That's right.
Because he did Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you see. Yes, and that's what he wanted to do instead of the Krypton.
He needs to keep Richard Dreyfuss employed at this point.
I can imagine Richard Dreyfuss as Superman. Another very short. I love the height requirements for Superman at this point between Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and
it's
Richard
not
Dreyfuss.
about height. He has superhuman strength. Who cares?
Oh, there you go. He can fly. If you can fly, who cares how tall you are? It makes it level. It's even more impressive when you leap the 5-story building in one single bound.
That's right.
Guy Hamilton was the one who actually got hired as director. Guy Hamilton of James Bond fame.
Yeah.
He was a British director. He had done a number of things. They hired him to direct the 2 Superman movies. The problem is they were shooting Superman in England. And Guy Hamilton had some tax problems in England. He was in exile because of these tax-related issues.
So artist friends, try to avoid tax problems, because if you have tax problems, it'll screw you out of work.
That's right. It's like not having your passport prepared is going to screw you out of work. Well, this screwed Guy Hamilton out of Superman, because Hamilton was like, well, if you don't shoot it in England, I'll direct it. And the Salkins were like, well, we kind of need to, because costs will be higher elsewhere. Yeah. So the nature of the production and the budget, even though it was pretty high budget, they had a $55 million budget ultimately for 2 movies.
That is crazy.
It is.
For that time.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there was a lot riding on this. Enter Richard Donner. Richard Donner had just directed an incredibly impressive and incredibly financially successful movie called The Omen. And I think even though The Omen is totally different than Superman, it doesn't take much to watch that movie and go, this guy can really figure things out. I mean, the thing that always comes to mind for me when I think of The Omen is the scene where Lee Remick falls from the banister. And there's a shot that follows her body as she falls and turns all the way down to the floor, a story below. And her son, Damien, knocked her off of there, who happens to be the Antichrist. Spoilers. And but that shot, you look at that and you go, they figured out how to do that shot without any CGI, without any green screens, just the good old-fashioned way. And that's what they needed with this movie, is they needed to figure out, how do you make a man fly and make it look realistic using the technology we have on hand? Many Guy Hamilton directed and supervised tests were done to help to see if they could do some of these superpowers, like running real fast and flying being the key one. $4 million by the time Richard Donner came onto the film had already been spent on testing effects. And you can see some of those effects. And as Richard Donner said, he thought $4 million had been wasted, because some of the effects, like one of them was basically an action figure with a cape on it in an air rocket. And they would fire this air rocket off, and this little action figure would fly through the air, and they'd try and film it. That was one possibility for how you could shoot the flying stuff. Another one was that when Superman runs, just before he takes the last step and takes flight, he turns into an animation. That was another possibility.
Yeah, I've seen that one, and I'm thinking, what were you thinking?
He literally would turn into a cartoon, and then when he flew, you would see him all cartoony. So Richard Donner was looking at this and just going, no.
Who approved this? Who said this was a good idea to even test it?
Well, I think about with the Richard Donner thing, the Salkins were stepping into uncharted water with some of these effects, and they were trying. But, you would think, to Donner's point, after $4 million, you could have come up with something a little better than him turning into a cartoon before he takes off. It kind of is reminiscent of the old George Reeves days when he would hit the trampoline, go out the window, and he would just be like on a board with smoke blowing by him for clouds. That's what Donner wanted to avoid. Verisimilitude, Donner said. That's what he wanted to evoke with his Superman movie. Now, Donner's deal was $1 million to direct both movies. And
bargain.
It's a pretty good deal.
Considering what he had to go through.
Yeah. And we'll get to that here shortly, too. But Donner said this script needs some work because after Puzo did his 400-page draft, a couple named David and Leslie Newman did another draft, which actually increased the page count to 500 pages. The script was 500 pages long, again, for 2 movies, but that's 250 pages per movie.
And there's a lot of action, so, that's...
Yeah, and we have to
page.
think about that this was like a standard script is 120 pages.
Yes.
So a 250-page script it's kind of crazy.
Yes.
And Donner agreed, and even more than Donner, a man named Tom Mankiewicz, who was brought on. He was of the Bond tradition. He had written The Man with the Golden Gun, and he had also, I believe, co-written Diamonds Are Forever. So he was a Bond guy. And he was also a good friend of Richard Donner's. And so Donner brought Tom Mankiewicz on to rewrite the script. And Tom did that. And according to Tom Mankiewicz, there's not a single word of the original Puzo and David Leslie Newman's script in his final version. Which I don't know if I believe that entirely. I think that because Puzo had broken it down like a Shakespearean play into acts. Like you would have the act that was happening on Krypton, then you would have the Smallville act, and then you would have the Metropolis. And that's kind of how it goes. But I do think that Mankiewicz probably polished it, tightened it. He removed a lot of stuff that Donner felt was stupid. Like at one point there was Telly Savalas was in the script because Telly was really big on television at the time as Kojak. So David and Leslie Newman, thinking it would be funny, put a scene in there where Superman flies past Kojak and Kojak is like, "Hey, baby," and it really silly, stupid stuff that now would be incredibly dated because kids wouldn't know who the hell Kojak was.
No.
It might have been funny in a theater in 1977, but not really, didn't really translate over. Now let's get into a little bit of the casting. We already talked about some of the possibilities for Superman.
Oh, what did Donner think about this? Has he ever?
I don't know what Donner thought about the Superman casting, but Donner was told by the Salkins that who they wanted to play Jor-El, after Paul Newman turned it down, was Marlon Brando. Godfather again.
They are going to shoehorn this in.
We should do a Godfather count, like at the top of the screen. Ding! A new Godfather reference. But Brando, who couldn't get arrested before The Godfather, suddenly was hot again. And he knew it, too. And the deal that the Salkins drew up with him proved that Marlon Brando knew how important he was now, yet again.
11 minutes of footage or something?
And only 12 days he was going to be on this set. He said, "I will be on the set for 12 days. This is Marlon Brando talking. I'm not going to imitate him. He said, "You're going to pay me $3.7 million. And I will get 12% of the gross."
Did he do it in his Godfather voice?
Probably not. He probably took the cotton out of his mouth.
Okay.
But his idea for this is that he was going to take this money, Marlon Brando, and make a 13-part Roots-style documentary, or miniseries rather, about the plight of the American Indian in our country. That never materialized. But he did take the money. Because just shortly before this, there was a huge controversy where Marlon won the Best Actor Academy Award, and he sent this poor lady from
the
Native American nation up on stage to say that he turned down the award, and then they booed her, and John Wayne said she should shut her mouth, and this big whole thing, right? Okay, so we'll move on from that. But that was Brando's original intention for the dough that he got, which again, $3.7 million for 12 days of work on this film. Right up front, he was going to be like the first thing they shot. Him and Gene Hackman, who was cast as Lex Luthor once Dustin Hoffman turned it down. And he got paid $2 million. So they want to get some big names in here, and they're not afraid of paying them some dough to do it. Robert Redford was offered Superman because at that time they were thinking, let's get 3 big names. Robert Redford wasn't really interested, nor was Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds. Can you imagine? I just imagine Superman with the stash.
Or he's like,
a lot of
I think of the Norm Macdonald impersonation.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of tongue rolling.
I want to see Norm Macdonald as Burt Reynolds
as Superman.
That's what I want to see.
Yeah, and I think
let's do that.
Let's see it. But all of these people, thankfully, said no. I mean, Robert Redford might have been interesting, but Burt Reynolds, I don't know. I think that what they eventually decided, which was to go with an unknown for Superman, was probably a good idea.
Yeah. Because if you're watching it, you're going to think that's Robert Redford.
Yes. Or, I mean, if it was Burt Reynolds, Burt Reynolds, you're definitely going to think that's Burt Reynolds.
Yeah.
The mustache.
I wonder if they would have just covered his mustache like Caesar.
Cesar Romero. Yeah. Or like they tried to do with Henry Cavill many years later.
Oh.
Neither were very successful. So what they eventually did was they did an exhaustive search for Superman. And they were doing Ilya Salkin's wife's dentist at one point.
I remember hearing about that.
They were trying to find him everywhere. It was akin to like after Sean Connery left James Bond and everybody who fit the bill in any which way auditioned for it. Yeah. And again, they were going for an unknown there. Here, I think the end result was far more successful. Because who they eventually found was a Juilliard-trained actor named Christopher Reeve. Now, a lot of people go, is he related to George Reeves?
No,
but you have to remember, yes, George Reeves played Superman back in the old black and white day. Christopher Reeve, with no S, just to happen to be, as a coincidence, was cast ultimately as Superman in the original 1978 film that we're talking about. Now, he was really skinny.
Yeah.
He was tall. He was 188 pounds. He was 6'4" and 188 pounds, which is pretty slight. But in spite of that, he did a screen test that really blew everybody away. And
he was very nervous. You could see his little sweat coming through the little suit.
The sweat patches underneath,
yes.
His armpits. But Richard Donner said the thing that really sold him on Christopher Reeve was they screen tested the scene where Superman is talking to Lois Lane on her balcony. And at one point, Superman steps down off the ledge, and there's this casual way that Christopher Reeve came down off the ledge. He thought, well, that's exactly what I want for Superman. Because you think of Superman as being this posturing kind of big guy with his fists on his hips. And what both Christopher Reeve and Richard Donner were looking for was a far more human version of Superman, the kind of a modern Superman, a Superman for the 70s and ultimately the 80s. And they found it. The Salkins were like, we must put this kid in muscle suit. Well, he didn't want to do the muscle suit. Christopher Reeve was like, I'm going to train.
Now, you know what I wish they'd have done?
What?
Before he started training, go ahead and film the stuff with him as a teenager when he was tinier.
Well, that part was played by a guy named Jeff East.
I know, but it just didn't, because they dubbed in the voice and they put the thing,
And Jeff East was not happy. Jeff East did not realize his voice was going to be dubbed. We're kind of jumping ahead a little bit.
Sorry, that was just something that always I thought, well, why didn't they just go ahead and film it with him before he started training, get that shot? I don't know how difficult that is. I'm thinking, go ahead, he'll look younger because by the time he trains, we start shooting, it'll be... And he'll be, we'll do something.
And Superman, Christopher Reeve, was bulking up even through shooting.
Yeah.
Because the stuff that was reshot later, and we'll get to that when we get to that, you can tell a difference.
Yes.
Christopher Reeve is a lot bigger in some of these shots in Superman and Superman 2. And his hair is different, and there's some continuity issues. So, yes, you're right. You could, instead of doing Jeff East, you could have cast him as the younger Smallville Clark Kent. You wouldn't have had to dub the voice. Jeff East, as I said, was not happy.
Shoot other things while he's bulking.
And then Jeff came to the movie premiere and was like, what's that coming out of my mouth? That's not my voice, because they dubbed him with Christopher
remember
Reeve.
As a kid that bothered me.
What?
That was one thing that bothered me, was that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, that's not Superman. Doesn't even look like him. I know he's supposed to be younger, but doesn't look like him. That's not that guy's voice. That's not. And I remember thinking that when I was a kid.
Well, that's a good point, and and I'm sure other people have thought that as well. Throughout the screen testing process, they found this actress named Margot Kidder. She gave an extraordinary screen test to play Lois Lane. If you see other screen tests from people like Ann Archer and others, they were great screen tests. Stockard Channing. They were kind of. I think they were thinking of the old George Reeves show because it's sort of stilted.
And then what's her face? I can't remember her name. The one that was in Superman the Musical, the televised one that played Lois Lane. Of course, she played it Hammy, like in the Superman the Musical televised.
Yeah.
But she auditioned for Lois Lane for the film as well.
And Lois.
And it was.
And again, I think what they were looking for with Lois was a modern 70s.
Yes.
Somebody who would come across not stilted, not like they were pretending like they were in the 30s.
Yes.
But
not
someone who would be
damsel in distress type.
Contemporary.
Yes.
And Margot Kidder played it that way and was cast and created a really interesting dynamic with Christopher Reeve. From what I've heard, they had a very like brother-sister kind of somewhat snarky at times relationship with each other because Christopher Reeve was taking the Superman thing very seriously, and Margot Kidder kind of liked to have a little more fun. But either way, their chemistry was evident as Superman and Lois Lane. Filming began on this thing in March 28th, 1977, filming for both films because again they were doing both at the same time. This was done at Pinewood Studios in London, and it lasted 19 months. This shoot until October of 1978, and they were not finished with the film even then. And we'll get to that here in a minute. The Fortress of Solitude, which is Superman's hangout up in the Arctic, was built in Shepperton Studios. So the scope of this was so epic that it could not even be contained at Pinewood Studios. It had to move off into other studios in the area. They actually even filmed for 5 weeks in New York. They filmed in New Mexico. They went around the world. They spared no expense. And that's something Richard Donner insisted upon. And this might have led to some tension. Also, they filmed in Canada.
To be fair, though, they've already blown $4 million
on tests that he thought were unnecessary.
A waste of money.
Yeah.
That $4 million could have gone to something else.
That's true.
And why would you go ahead and start? I mean, I don't know. I would want to find my director first and then test special because he's the one that's putting this together.
Well, they thought it was Guy Hamilton, though.
Okay,
because he was overseeing. He was overseeing all these tests that didn't turn out well, and then the tax problems. Then they got Donner. The tensions during the shooting were pretty extreme. And what I've learned from my time in the film industry is that whatever they say it is, as bad as they say it is, it's usually about 20 times worse from anything you've ever heard. Because a lot of people go, I'm not going to talk about that. And ultimately, that's what happened with a lot of people, though Donner has come out and talked about it more later. Donner says they never showed him a budget. They never showed him a schedule. But all he kept hearing from the Salkins was, you're over budget and you're over schedule. And so when Donner at one point, just in pure frustration, said, okay, we'll schedule it for 2 days and I'll be 6 months over, okay? Because and Pierre Spangler, who was the producer actually on the set, was the guy who had to butt heads with Donner on a daily, face-to-face, eye-to-eye basis. Donner hated Pierre Spangler. Donner later said that if there was a certain time in his life that if he ever saw Pierre Spangler in person again, he would have killed him. That's how bad it got.
But you kind of, I don't know how true, but I've heard that the actors were kind of on
the actors, Donner. They loved Donner because Donner was an actor's director and always had been. Even going back to the Oldman days when he worked with Gregory Peck and Lee Remick, everyone had good things to say about Donner. Actually, even going back to the days when he was directing episodes of The Night Gallery, he was great with actors. And so they really liked him. The producers didn't like him because the producers' point of view was, we can be doing this faster, quicker. This is not how we make movies. The Salkins saying, we don't make movies like this.
They've never made a movie like this.
No one had ever made a movie like this.
So you can't really compare making Superman where you're developing new effects, a new genre, to doing 3 and 4 Musketeers.
Right, in which you didn't have to worry about making people fly realistically and all that.
You can't come under budget and on time on something like that because you know what the formula is. Well,
the director of those movies that you mentioned, Richard Lester, was brought in. Remember, he was one of their original choices to direct the movie. He was not available at the time. By the time all these shenanigans were going on, Richard Lester had already finished that project. So the Salkins asked Richard Lester to come on and mediate. And here's a story for you. This is what Richard Donner later said that Lester told him. Lester had directed the 3 and 4 Musketeers. According to Donner, Richard Lester told him, I never got paid for fully for the 3 and 4 Musketeers. And Lester had sued the Salkins for the remainder of his pay for the 3 and 4 Musketeers. And Lester said every time, and he won the suit, but he said every time he tried to collect, they would move the company to another country. And he said the only way, he told Richard Donner, he said, look, I'm not here to take over your movie. The only way I'm going to make my money back that I'm owed from these people is to take this consultant's check. So I'm not going to mess with you on this film. I'm just going to be around, and they're going to pay me my money that I'm due from the Musketeers.
That just all sounds shady, because if someone owed me money and they were like, come, this is, no, I had to sue you for a paycheck. Why would I come and work for you?
You're not buying it?
I don't buy that, because I know what I would do. Like I said, if I made 2 films for someone and I didn't get paid and I had to sue them for my pay, and I still wasn't getting paid, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with them. Would you?
I understand that perspective. No, I agree. I would not do
You're
that.
Like, okay, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I'm not getting involved with you jokers, you shady, shady people.
Donner didn't buy it either. He said he accepted this, but he was always a little antsy about Richard Lester. And maybe he had good reason to be.
He saw him go to lunch with that guy he wants to kill.
Yeah. The Salkins said this, and I want to give the Salkins side of the story as well.
Okay.
Because, in all fairness.
Yes.
The Salkins said that Richard Donner couldn't make up his mind on things. They said they found him to be completely indecisive when it came to decisions, and they needed answers, and he would not give it to them, and it cost more time and more budget.
Did they ever think maybe he couldn't give them answers on things because they were having to create it?
I don't know. You're Team Donner. So
I am.
You're so
I'm
Team
sorry.
Donner.
I'm sorry. Well, I saw what happened to those movies after he left,
Yeah, and we're getting to that. We got to get to that, though.
I'm sorry.
So at a certain point, after 19 months of shooting Superman Part 1 and 2, the Salkins solution was, we got to shut down this sucker because we are hemorrhaging money. So what we're going to do is we're going to shut this down and concentrate on Superman Part 1, get that out. And if that's a success, we'll come back and we'll worry about Superman 2. So the original plan was scrapped, though they had made a lot of headway on Superman 2. They had filmed 75% of Superman 2.
But if they had filmed so much of Superman, why did they change the ending of Superman 1?
Well,
which was going to be the ending of 2 originally.
Yes. Well, this is what happened. When they shut down the movie, they had to release Part 1.
Yes.
The way they decided to end Superman 1, which in the script was Superman throws this missile out into space, it explodes, and we haven't even gotten into the story, so you might not understand what we're talking about, but it sets loose the Phantom Zone criminals who were trapped on Krypton, General Zod, Ursa, and Non. Scourges of Krypton.
And can we also point out, this was the first time anyone ever really filmed 2 movies together.
Yes, this was a long time before Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it was unheard
Well,
of.
I mean, they had done the 3 and 4 Musketeers.
Yeah, but
not on this scale.
This scale. So of course you're going to be worried. You're making 2 movies, the Part 1 and a sequel. And usually you do Part 1, you see how it does, you take some of the money from that and you put it towards the kitty on the second one.
Yeah, which is what they did with The Godfather.
Yes.
If we're going to go to the Godfather model.
That's what
they did one at a time.
So, I mean, I think it's brilliant that people film movies in lump sum because you never know what might happen to an actor, someone may not come back, and it ruins continuity and all that stuff. But if you're worrying about hemorrhaging money and not having anything coming in, of course that's going to give you anxiety. You're filming 2 movies and not having a little bit of, you don't know how it's going to do, and you're investing in 2 movies.
Well, I think the Salkins' point, though, was this. They were like, with the 3 and 4 Musketeers, we had Richard Lester directing it. He shoots with 3 cameras. He can get 1 scene in 3 times less time than Richard Donner.
Not flying people.
But they're thinking this, though. That's what I'm trying to give their point of view. They're thinking that way. They're like, we did this really cheap before, and it worked, and both movies were successful. Why is this not working?
That's like
and mainly why it's not working is because Richard Donner is working with an incredible cinematographer named Jeffrey Unsworth, who, unlike this is not unusual. Jeffrey Unsworth was a master. And any master cinematographer is not going to allow a director to shoot with 3 cameras.
No.
A cinematographer,
it's not TV.
A cinematographer wants to do 1 shot at a time. Okay, now we're going to do the close-up. I will light your close-up. Now we're going to do the wide shot. I will light your wide shot. The thing about doing 3-camera technique, which is what Richard Lester did on the Three Musketeers, is you have to wash the set in a general light. Yeah. And you have to be able to shoot every angle so that you get the exposure you want. So there's no nuance.
No, and you probably can't do that with the effect stuff they were trying to pull off. And some of the costumes and
it's a lot more difficult.
You can't just do. It's like comparing, hey, we did, the reality show Big Brother, and it cost us nothing. And now we're doing, think of some Game of Thrones. Why does this cost so much more? Because they're two different genres.
Right.
It's like comparing apples to oranges. Right. as our economic teacher used to say all the time.
Well, you have this, and it's Guns and Butter. That's what Guns and Butter. Which is the stupidest analogy, but every business teacher wants to do that. But anyway, let's get back to the ending of part 1.
Sorry.
So when they decided to cut this thing off, 75% in part 2 and all of part 1 pretty much shot, they said, let's finish up these flying things. And I don't really have time to go into the flying effects, but they used this front projection, which was very different from rear projection. Mm-hmm. And it's very technical, and we won't go into that, but it created the air that the person was inside the frame a lot more than rear projection, which sometimes you could tell it was on a wall behind. So what they wanted Superman to really look like he was flying with this background with, trees and buildings and shit moving. And they also developed really cool ways of zooming so that the action that you're zooming into matched what was already projected. So it looked like Superman was flying toward the camera and away from it and banking and really interesting stuff. All of that, as you said, had to be developed especially for this movie, which I'm sure ate up a lot of time and a lot of money.
A lot of money.
But anyway, so when they cut it off and they said, we're going to finish Superman 1, they had to take the ending from Superman 2 and put it at the end of Superman 1 because they had no ending for Superman 1 because originally they hadn't quite figured out what the cliffhanger was going to be aside from Zod and the Phantom Zone criminals being set free by this missile blast. So they were like, okay, we'll worry about them getting set free in part 2, okay? We're just going to have him turn time backwards, which is what he does to save Lois Lane, which is something there's a lot of controversy over this. People go, that's not Superman's powers, But if you want to get into non-Superman powers, look at part 2 where he's like a telepath or he's telekinetic or something, But anyway, we won't go into that too much more. But let me just say that when Superman 1 was released, it was a financial, what would be the best word?
Juggernaut.
It was a juggernaut. It was a behemoth.
It was a Superman.
This movie made so much damn money. It made, I think it was $300 million worldwide in its first run. Now, this is in 1978. December of 1978. Can you imagine making $300 million worldwide in 1978?
Wasn't it like number 1 for 13 weeks?
It set every box office record. In fact, the first week grossed $18.5 million, which was the most a movie had ever made in 1 week's time in history.
And this is after Star Wars.
And it had, speaking of Star Wars, John Williams, who replaced Jerry Goldsmith as the composer. And if you don't know John Williams' Superman theme, how dare you?
As Richard Donner says, the music even says Superman.
That's right. He loved that bit.
He did.
So the Salkines were raking in this dough, and they were like, let's do Superman 2.
But yet, it does so well. And instead of going, let's stick to the formula, we got some money now.
Well, let me tell them what they did.
Okay.
Pierre Spengler did an interview with Variety after the premiere of Superman Part 1. And he said he couldn't wait to work with Richard Donner again. He said there was some tension, but we got over it. It's going to be great. Variety went to Donner for his comment on this. Donner said, and I quote, "If he's on it, I'm not," talking about Pierre Spengler. Again, Donner said he would kill him if he ever saw him in public. So he was not interested. So basically, when it came time to renegotiate to finish Superman 2, the ultimatum was Donner said, I don't want Pierre Spengler.
That's real easy. We'll keep him, but we'll keep him the hell away from you.
Well, this became personal because Ilya Salkind was a childhood friend of Pierre Spengler, and Alexander Salkind was Pierre Spengler's boss. So they had this like 3-man dynamic making all these movies for all these years, and they basically pulled the loyalty card and said, "Sorry, Richard, we're picking Pierre over you, and we don't like you anyway because you're pain in our ass. You have pain in ass," he says to Alexander. And so they approached Guy Hamilton, Guy Hamilton had apparently solved his tax problems.
He finally paid them all.
Yeah, and he's like, finally, I can do a Superman movie. But Guy Hamilton, unfortunately, had already committed to another picture, so he couldn't do it. Richard Lester, who was the mediator and the director of the 3 and 4 Musketeers, was ultimately hired to replace Richard Donner for additional shooting on Superman 2, which originally was just going to be 75% of it was done. They were just going to shoot what was left. When Richard Donner came on board, he said, well, there are other things in this that I want to change. Richard Lester. Yeah. When Richard Lester came on board, he said there were other things that I want to change and not just finish the movie. So
if they're so penny pinching, why would they go, okay, because you're spending more money? I'll be like, no, just finish what you need to finish, because, we harassed poor Richard Donner over here about every penny, and now we're like, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we're not only going to let you finish the movie, we're going to reshoot shit, which is what Richard Lester wanted. Brando had sued the Salkinds after the release of Superman Part 1 because he said they didn't pay him the 12% of the profits that was a part of his deal.
He must have gotten a letter from Richard Lester.
Well, the Salkinds, they lost the case. The Salkinds did, and they had to pay him $15 million in back income. And so what
they couldn't move their office again?
I guess not. And so what they decided was, when it came time for Superman 2, because Marlon Brando in his 12 days shot footage for Part 1 and Part 2. He was going to be in both movies. Mm-hmm. Well, the Salkinds were like, we don't want to pay him 12% of Part 2's profits because he already got $15 million out of us. But again, that was part of the deal, so he was owed it. So anyway, and the 3.7 to appear up front. So I think, again, this was kind of personal. They decided let's take Marlon Brando out of this. So they're like, Richard Lester, while you're reshooting other shit, let's reshoot some shit with the mother, with Laura instead.
Made no sense.
And so that's what Richard Lester decided to do, is to take the Marlon Brando scenes out of Part 2 and replace it with the mother, who was played by Susanna York. So Susanna York's part got padded. I'm sure she appreciated that. Oh. And she was a lot cheaper than Marlon Brando. But then again, a lot of people were a lot cheaper than Marlon Brando.
She's like, oh, mama gets some new shoes this year.
Tom Mankiewicz did not return to work on the script when they were retooling it for Richard Lester's vision. So Richard Lester brought in David and Leslie Newman, who had written the Kojak stuff, because Richard Lester said that he did not care for Donner's vision in so much as he did not see it as a grandiose mythological story. He said that he saw it as something that you could experiment with in a quirky way. And he wanted to make it more into a comic book by accentuating garish colors and making the frames look like panels out of a comic.
But there's a difference between a comic book and a comic strip.
Well, I think that's what he wanted to do, was more of the comic strip, the sillier type thing. And David and Leslie Newman liked doing kind of silly stuff. So he liked them on the script, and so they got rehired to rewrite Part 2 to Richard Lester's specifications. Gene Hackman also did not return. So basically, the easiest way to figure out what Richard Donner directed in Part 2 is look for Gene Hackman, because Gene Hackman, anytime you see Gene Hackman's face, that was Richard Donner.
Didn't they like dub in a voice that's not his?
They got a stand-in and a sound alike for the Lester stuff, because Lester wanted to do some silly stuff in there. The editor, Stuart Baird, did not return either.
Why didn't he return? Was it just like, no, Donner's not in, I'm out, or I'm just
pretty much?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I knew, like I said, a lot of people were.
And he was
Donner.
Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman could say that. But Margot Kidder said that, and they were like, honey, you're on contract, because she tried to leave like Gene Hackman did, but Margot Kidder was not the star that Gene Hackman was. So she was forced to return to the Superman reshoots under Richard Lester. Now, some things that they added per Richard Lester's specifications was, instead of the missile that Superman diverts from the fault line, setting loose the Phantom Zone criminals, Richard Lester wanted to have a scene at the Eiffel Tower with terrorists and Superman a bomb, and Superman throws this elevator with a bomb in it, and that's what sets it off. So Lester had that put into the script. There's a scene in Donner's version at the very beginning where Lois has kind of figured out, she has a suspicion that Clark Kent is Superman, so she throws herself out of the window at the Daily Planet, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it has a humorous element. Apparently not humorous enough for Richard Lester, because he would rather her jump off there at the Niagara Falls. She jumps into a river. So Richard Lester thought that would be more fun. Instead of her jumping out of the window at the Daily Planet, let's have her jump into a river. And he jumps in to try and save her. And, pretends to be, yeah, there's the face. But I think the most infamous Richard Lester decision was when they came time to end 2, they didn't have the world turning around backwards, so they had to come up with a new ending. So Richard Lester came up, along with David and Leslie Newman, with the idea of the magic kiss. Exactly. So what happens is Superman, Lois, having discovered who Superman is, returns to the Daily Planet once the Phantom Zone criminals have been destroyed at the Fortress of Solitude. And she can't live with this, knowing this. It's really messing her up. And so Superman takes the burden off of her by kissing her and somehow erasing her memory.
What freaking burden? I don't understand this. I'm so burdened that I know that.
Well, that was Richard Lester's decision of how you end Superman 2, is you have him kiss Lois and remove the memory, and then we can go on in future movies, and we don't have to deal with her knowing who he is.
Also, because I've seen the Donner cut and obviously the Lester version.
Yeah, which everyone knew. The Lester version, part 2, is what we grew up with.
Yes, what we grew up with. But when
You've always heard that Richard Donner had shot other things, but unlike you kids nowadays, you couldn't watch it. We couldn't watch it. We didn't know the difference.
We were stuck with this. But when I saw the Donner cut, I was like, oh, Lois Lane is actually intelligent in this version. She is not a moron. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree? She was smarter, particularly with the scene where she gets him to admit that he's Superman, that she pulls the gun and she shoots it. And he's like, yeah, I'm him. It didn't do anything. And then she goes, it was blank, sucker.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's really smart. And it's funny, but it's not slapstick funny, but it's.
And she's
just not a bumbling idiot.
I should say that the scene you're referring to is from the Donner and Mankiewicz version of the script.
Yes.
For part 2, which when they're in Niagara Falls, looking into a hotel scam, Lois Lane, the way she figures out, instead of throwing herself in the river, is she pulls out a gun, tries to shoot Clark Kent, and says, well, this bullet will bounce off of you because I know you're Superman. He admits it, and then she's like, it's a blank, So, I mean, that is a cool scene. Unfortunately, that's part of the section that Richard Donner had never filmed. So in the Richard Donner cut of the movie, which was later released, you see the screen. That was Margot Kidder's screen test.
Well, thank God they had it in a screen test.
They had it in a screen test, yeah. I want to say about Christopher Reeve, he was not too thrilled with Richard Lester taking over either. In the time between the incomplete shooting of Superman 1 and 2 and the restart of Superman 2, he had done a movie called Somewhere in Time, which is a really good movie based on a Richard Matheson novel. And he did not like this whole Donner being fired bit. Yeah. And the producers hit him up and they said, Chris, after you finish that Somewhere in Time movie, 5 days later, you need to be on the set in your Superman costume. And Christopher Reeve was like, what are you talking about? And there was a little bit of an artistic disagreement that led to a very brief lawsuit in which Christopher Reeve said, you paid Marlon Brando $3.7 million for 12 days. You paid Gene Hackman $2 million for 2 movies. You paid me $250,000 for 2 movies.
And he carries the movie.
That was Christopher Reeve's salary for Superman 1 and 2, $250,000. Which is a very small fraction of what Marlon Brando got paid. And he is the title character of Superman.
Yes.
So basically, the deal they came to for him returning to Superman 2 was you would accept that money as being full payment for both movies, but we will give you some artistic control over part 2 and your character's direction, the character of Superman Clark Kent.
Why didn't he say, I want Donner back?
Well, I don't know. I don't think the Salkinds had any interest in bringing Donner back, no matter who said it. I think they took it personally.
I guess he doesn't have that much control at that point.
Well, I honestly, though, I don't think they would have let Donner. I don't care if God himself had come down and said, hire Richard Donner back. Salkinds were like, you insulted us. We are not hiring Richard Donner back. Like, that's just the impression I get.
Yeah.
Anyway, filming began in February, or filming was renewed, I should say, in February of 1979. Again, as I said before, Richard Donner used the 3-camera technique. And Richard Lester, I'm sorry. There's all these fucking Richards. Yeah, Richard Lester used the 3-camera technique on Superman 2, which led to, Jeffrey Unsworth sadly had passed away. So that was the cinematographer Richard Donner worked with. So the movie, the reshot footage, and it looks, you can tell a difference.
Yeah.
Maybe when you're growing up, you can't tell a difference, but you can tell a difference if you know the story.
Like I said, when I was a kid, I loved part 1. It was my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And the other ones, you're watching them because you just want more Superman. You want more Chris Reeve, Yeah. But when you get older and you revisit them, just the quality, you notice it.
It is pretty, Richard Donner, when he did the Phantom Zone Criminals, Zod and them, you can see the scenes Donner directed because Zod is actually a lot darker looking. Like, he's pale and he has these dark rings under his eyes. They look a lot more sinister and menacing.
Yes, they do.
When Richard Lester came on, again, it went back to his more comic booky, clean line, garish color sort of thing. So even from scene to scene, there's no continuity, especially with Lois Lane's hair.
Yes,
that jumps out a lot. The color,
and her makeup as well. Like, some scenes she looks kind of dead, and then others she's.
Well, we'll talk for a second. We were running out of time, but we'll talk for a second about Donner's footage. These are the things that Donner did. Basically, everything with Gene Hackman. Lex in prison, when he escapes prison, when he goes in to meet the Phantom Zone criminals, everything with Gene Hackman. The criminals, the Phantom Zone criminals, when they're on the moon, when they kill the astronauts, Richard Lester reshot some of the things in that make them a little blander looking and a little more like what he thought a comic book panel was. Donner had created these really wild shots with movement, and particularly one in particular where they're flying toward Earth and the camera sort of spins around and comes really cinematic. Like, Donner was very cinematic. Yes. Lester was very, let's make this like a flat comic strip.
Yeah, I was going to compare it. I don't know if this is a good comparison, but like Happy Days, the first 2 seasons are shot like film. Mm-hmm. They're like, we want it to be American Graffiti every week. And then after that, it's a set with several cameras and it's kind of cheesier, waka waka.
Yeah.
You can tell the difference.
You can definitely tell the difference in this. All the Rocky scenes, which is the bully at the diner, that was Richard Donner. The footage of Lex and Miss Tessmacher when they come into the Fortress of Solitude, Donner. Let's see. The second part at the end of the movie, there's this whole thing where Superman turns the tables on the Phantom Zone criminals, removes their powers, and gets his own back. Half of that is Lester. The first half of that was Lester using a stand-in for Gene Hackman. Hey, hadn't you ever heard of parachutes? That's the stand-in, and a really bad voice, because you can always tell that's not Gene Hackman. But the second half of the scene, basically the part where Gene Hackman walks down and joins them and you see his face, that's Donner.
Yeah.
Now, Superman 2, when it was released, was a huge hit for the time. $190 million. Nearly, not as much as Superman 1, about $100 million less. But still, $190 million is pretty amazing. So when we were growing up, we'd always heard the story about Richard Donner's version of Superman 2. We didn't get to actually see it until
we'd never get to see it.
And then Superman Returns came out, and the new interest in Superman in 2006 brought about the Richard Donner cut of Superman, which the scenes that were put back in were the opening at the Daily Planet where Lois jumps out the window. There is the shooting the blank scene.
Yes.
Every scene with Marlon Brando was put back in. Which
he's dead. We don't have to pay him.
I love the scene where Clark goes back to get his powers back from Brando. And Brando appears as Jor-El, appears in physical form and touches his son and gives the son the power back. And the deal is that once I give you your powers back, the Fortress of Solitude is useless. This is the last bit of Kryptonian energy, and you'll never see me again, and you're on your own. You're truly on your own. So do you want this, kid? And Clark says, I messed up, Dad. I got no choice. I want to see you again, but I have to save the world from these Phantom Zone criminals who are going to destroy it, undoubtedly destroy it. No one can stand up to them except for me. And so Brando appears in a kind of physical form, touches Clark on the shoulder, and gives him back his powers, and thus ends their communication permanently. So I love that scene.
Yeah, that is a good.
The Phantom Zone criminals. Let's see. The very ending of the movie is restored entirely without a lot of the Richard Lester silliness, where they're throwing weird shit at each other in the Fortress of Solitude. I think that one of the stranger things that was not added back into the Donner cut, I don't understand why, but there is a scene, and it's on the special features, so they could have added it back. They have the scene. But at the end of the movie, after the Phantom Zone criminals are destroyed in the Fortress of Solitude,
yes,
Superman and Lois leave the Fortress of Solitude, and Superman destroys it because, as I said before, it's now useless.
Yes.
So he uses his heat vision, right, and destroys it. Lex, Superman, and Lois were in the Fortress of Solitude. And the next scene, you see Superman and Lois outside the fortress, and he uses his heat vision to destroy Fortress of Solitude. Mm-hmm. So my brain went, was Lex in there? Did he just fucking kill Lex in the Fortress of Solitude? He didn't. There's a scene where they take Lex and they put him down, and they're going to take him back to prison. That, for some reason, was left out of the Donner cut. And it seems like a big mistake, because it takes me out of the movie in the Donner cut when I'm wondering, where did Lex go?
I wonder if any fans have put it in there again.
I don't know.
On YouTube or something.
They should. That would be like the ultimate cut. But so anyway, that I wanted to point that out because that always struck me as really odd. Like, Donner, why didn't you put that in? That doesn't make sense, really. What happened to Lex? Because you never learn what happened to Lex.
Did they see what happened to Miss Tessbacher? Because she's in it, and then
she disappeared.
Disappears. Was she supposed to have more, and they just didn't shoot it? Or
it might have been something that Donner was planning that never got shot. And obviously, in 2006, you can't shoot with the original actors anymore. So you have what you have. I think they shot some inserts for the Donner cut, like hands picking stuff up. But beyond that, you just had what you had.
Yeah.
But I think for kind of a cobbled together thing, the screen test was used as a scene in the movie. It's not bad.
I enjoyed it better than the Lester. When I saw it, I just thought, yeah, I like this. This makes.
Well, Richard Lester. Well, the sad thing is, Donner.
I'm hating on Lester and the.
Well, the thing about it is that Donner had a vision for how this series could go on.
Yes.
We'll never know what Donner and Tom Mankiewicz had come up with for how the series would progress, but they had future films in mind. We're going to start talking on the next part of this show about the two films that were made.
When you hear about comic book films today, they always credit Donner and his vision.
Yes.
You never hear about the Salkinds. I mean, you kind of, but it's never their vision that developed. Yeah. It's Donner. I wonder how they feel about that.
I don't know. And I know Ilya, and I have to give him a lot of credit, because if he hadn't said, Dad, this would make a good movie.
He had vision.
You never would have had any of this. Donner, Lester, or anything.
Exactly.
Or Christopher Reeve. So I can't really fault him entirely. I think business-wise, and I think personally, there were a lot of problems that just mucked up the whole affair.
Yes.
It was a combination of money, time, and real serious personal animosity, so far as I can see.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Donner, if you see this and I'm wrong, I wasn't there, and I'm not trying to step out of turn.
I think a lot of it was out of really, anyone's. You're inventing something.
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot of trial and error, and you're not going to get it right the first time.
Well,
so you've got to think about that. I don't really think, Donner's being irresponsible with the money. He gave you a fantastic product.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the thing is, the first movie, Donner's original, completely unfettered first Superman movie, will always be there for us to enjoy.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, we'll never know what came later. And, growing up, I really liked 2. I didn't know all the drama about it. I thought it was a really good movie. And there is a lot of Donner in it.
Yes.
Now, when we get into like Superman 3, we're going to see what happens when you give Richard Lester the reins all by himself with no Donner footage to work from. And so that's a little tease for next week's show, which will be part 2 in our exploration of the original Superman series.
And I have to say, it's probably what, affects my opinion of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I've already seen, I know what's coming. So
what affects you? Yeah, Superman 3?
Yeah. Knowing and seeing Superman 3 colors my opinion of what happened with Donner and Richard Lester.
I see. Yeah, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because I see what happened with 3. And I go,
yeah, I understand that. And we'll leap into that more next week as we continue to explore this series. Until then, I would like to thank Rebecca again for being on the show. I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Let us know your opinion about this Superman Donner Lester Salkin debacle. And until next time, take care of yourselves.